Jerusalem had never been so crowded. Every year as Passover approached, pilgrims traveled from every corner of Judea, Galilee, and even distant regions of the Roman Empire. Families walked for days to celebrate the feast that commemorated Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt. Ancient roads filled with merchants, shepherds, Roman soldiers, priests, and worshippers, all converging on one sacred city. Historians estimate that the population of Jerusalem multiplied dramatically during the festival. The Temple Mount became the spiritual heart of the nation, where thousands of sacrificial lambs would soon be offered according to the law of Moses. The air was filled with prayers, the sound of shofars, and the anticipation of one of Judaism's holiest celebrations. Yet beneath the appearance of celebration, tension filled the streets. Roman authorities reinforced the city with additional troops, fearing that the massive crowds could spark another rebellion. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, traveled from Caesarea to Jerusalem specifically for the feast, determined to maintain order at any cost. The memory of previous uprisings still haunted the empire, and every Passover carried the possibility of unrest. At the same time, the religious leaders watched another growing concern. For nearly 3 years, Jesus of Nazareth had traveled across Galilee and Judea, healing the sick, restoring the blind, raising the dead, and proclaiming the coming kingdom of God. His arrival in Jerusalem only days earlier had drawn extraordinary attention. Crowds welcomed him with palm branches, shouting words reserved for a king, while many believed the long-awaited Messiah had finally come. To some, he represented hope. To others, he represented danger. Behind closed doors, members of the Sanhedrin debated how to stop him without provoking the crowds who admired him. Political pressure, religious authority, and growing public expectation were rapidly colliding, setting the stage for one of history's most consequential nights. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the hills surrounding Jerusalem, Jesus quietly made preparations to celebrate Passover with his closest disciples. None of them realized that within the next 12 hours, history would change forever. As evening settled over Jerusalem, Jesus and his disciples quietly made their way through the narrow streets toward a large upper room that had been prepared for the Passover meal. While thousands of families across the city gathered to remember Israel's deliverance from Egypt, this particular meal would become one of the most significant moments in human history. Passover was far more than a shared dinner. It was a sacred memorial established nearly 15 centuries earlier, when God delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Every element on the table carried profound meaning. The unleavened bread reminded the people of their hurried departure. The bitter herbs recalled the suffering of bondage. The cups of wine celebrated God's promises of redemption. And the roasted lamb pointed back to the night when the blood placed on Israelite doorposts spared their firstborn from death. For generations, Jewish families had repeated this ceremony, exactly as their ancestors had done. But on this night, everything was about to change. As the disciples took their places around the table, an unexpected silence filled the room. According to the customs of the time, the lowest-ranking servant would normally wash the dust from the guests' feet before the meal began. Yet no servant was present, and none of the disciples stepped forward to perform the task. Instead, Jesus quietly rose from the table. He removed his outer garment, wrapped a linen towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and began washing the feet of his own disciples. One by one, the men watched in stunned silence. The one they called Rabbi, the one they believed to be the Messiah, had taken the position of the lowest servant in the household. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter immediately protested. The thought of his master kneeling before him was unimaginable. But Jesus gently explained that unless Peter allowed this act of humility, he could have no share with him. Realizing the deeper meaning behind Jesus' words, Peter passionately replied that he wanted not only his feet washed, but also his hands and his head. When Jesus finished, he looked around the room and gave his disciples a lesson they would never forget. Greatness in the kingdom of God would never be measured by power, wealth, or status. True greatness would always be measured by humble service. As the Passover meal continued, Jesus took the unleavened bread, gave thanks, broke it before them, and spoke words unlike any ever heard during a Passover celebration. "This is my body, given for you." Then he lifted the cup after supper. "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for many." For centuries, every Passover had pointed backward, to Israel's rescue from Egypt. Now, for the first time, Jesus pointed it forward. The symbols of the ancient feast were no longer simply remembering an old deliverance. They were becoming the living picture of a far greater redemption that was about to unfold. Within the next few hours, the disciples listened, but none of them yet understood the full meaning of what they had just witnessed. After finishing the Passover meal, Jesus and his disciples left the upper room and stepped into the cool night air of Jerusalem. The city, so full of celebration only hours earlier, had grown quieter. Oil lamps flickered through the narrow streets as groups of pilgrims settled in for the night, unaware that history was quietly unfolding around them. Crossing the Kidron Valley, Jesus led his disciples toward a familiar place at the foot of the Mount of Olives, a garden called Gethsemane. Its name came from the Aramaic expression meaning oil press. The garden was surrounded by ancient olive trees, many of which had stood there for generations. Every harvest season, olives were crushed under immense pressure to produce precious oil. It was a fitting setting for what Jesus himself was about to endure. For the first time recorded in the Gospels, the emotional weight resting upon him became unmistakably visible. Jesus had often spoken with authority before crowds, calmed violent storms, confronted religious leaders, and even raised the dead. Yet in Gethsemane, his disciples witnessed something they had never seen before. He was overwhelmed with sorrow. Taking Peter, James, and John farther into the garden, Jesus spoke words that revealed the depth of his anguish. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He asked them to remain awake and pray with him. Then he walked a short distance away, fell to the ground, and began to pray. The Gospels describe this moment with remarkable honesty. Jesus prayed that, if it were possible, the cup before him might pass away. Yet every prayer ended with complete surrender. "Not my will, but yours be done." Luke, the physician who carefully investigated the events of Jesus' life, records an extraordinary detail. As Jesus prayed with increasing intensity, his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Many medical researchers have associated this description with an extremely rare condition known as hematidrosis. Under overwhelming physical and emotional stress, tiny blood vessels surrounding the sweat glands can rupture, causing blood to mix with perspiration. Though uncommon, the condition has been documented throughout medical history and illustrates the unimaginable pressure Jesus was experiencing that night. Meanwhile, only a short distance away, the disciples repeatedly fell asleep. Exhausted by the long day and unable to grasp the magnitude of what was happening, they could not stay awake even for a single hour. 3 times Jesus returned to find them sleeping. 3 times he urged them to watch and pray. The contrast could not have been greater. While heaven and earth stood on the edge of one of history's greatest moments, the men closest to Jesus struggled simply to keep their eyes open. Then, after hours of prayer, something changed. The anguish gave way to unwavering resolve. Jesus rose from the ground with complete peace, fully committed to the path before him. The moment of decision had passed. The betrayal he had long foretold was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The silence of Gethsemane did not last long. As Jesus finished speaking to his disciples, distant lights began moving through the darkness. The flickering glow of torches and lanterns slowly descended the slopes of the Mount of Olives. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the olive grove. The moment Jesus had anticipated had finally arrived. Leading the group was Judas Iscariot, one of the 12. For nearly 3 years, Judas had walked beside Jesus. He had witnessed the miracles, listened to every teaching, and shared meals with the other disciples. Yet behind the scenes, he had already agreed to betray his master in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. the price commonly paid for an ordinary slave under Jewish law. The arresting party was no ordinary crowd. The Gospels describe a mixed force composed of temple guards sent by the chief priests and elders, accompanied by Roman soldiers. During Passover, Jerusalem's population swelled dramatically, and Roman authorities remained on high alert to prevent unrest. Any public figure capable of gathering large crowds was considered a potential threat to public order. Judas had chosen the perfect location. Jesus often came to Gethsemane to pray, making it easy to find him away from the crowds that filled the city during the day. As the soldiers entered the garden, Judas approached Jesus without hesitation. He greeted him with the customary kiss of friendship and respect, a gesture that in Jewish culture symbolized loyalty and affection. But on this night it became the sign of betrayal. Jesus looked at Judas and calmly asked, "Friend, do what you came to do." The irony was unmistakable. A symbol of love had become an instrument of treachery. Stepping forward before anyone could seize him, Jesus addressed the armed crowd directly. "Whom are you seeking?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. Jesus answered simply, "I am he." According to John's Gospel, the moment he spoke those words, the soldiers and officers drew back and fell to the ground. The text offers no detailed explanation for what caused such a reaction. Whether it was overwhelming fear, divine authority, or the sheer power of the moment, even those sent to arrest him were briefly overcome before a single hand had been laid upon him. Yet Jesus made no attempt to escape. Instead, he willingly surrendered himself. Meanwhile, panic spread among the disciples. Simon Peter drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus immediately stopped the violence. He rebuked Peter, reminding him that those who live by the sword would perish by the sword. Then, in one final miracle before his crucifixion, he touched Malchus's wounded ear and healed him completely. Even in the very moment of his arrest, Jesus was still restoring. Turning toward the chief priests, temple officers, and elders, Jesus asked why they had come armed with swords and clubs, as though he were a dangerous criminal. Every day, he had taught openly in the temple courts. No one had arrested him there. But now, under the cover of darkness, the final journey toward the cross had begun. Bound and surrounded by armed guards, Jesus was led back through the dark streets of Jerusalem. Instead of being taken immediately before the full council, he was first brought to Annas, the former high priest. Although he no longer officially held the office, Annas remained one of the most influential men in Judea. His family controlled much of the temple leadership, and several of his sons, along with his son-in-law Caiaphas, had served as high priest under Roman authority. It was before Annas that the first interrogation began. He questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teachings, hoping to obtain statements that could later be used against him. But Jesus calmly answered that he had always taught publicly, in synagogues and in the temple courts, where anyone could hear his words. "I have spoken openly to the world. There is nothing I said in secret." Frustrated by his response, one of the temple officers struck Jesus across the face. It was the first physical abuse recorded after his arrest. Yet even then, Jesus did not respond with anger. "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to what is wrong. But if I have spoken truthfully, why do you strike me?" Unable to build a convincing case, Annas sent Jesus to Caiaphas, the acting high priest, where members of the Sanhedrin had already begun gathering. The Sanhedrin was the highest Jewish judicial and religious council, composed of chief priests, elders, and respected teachers of the law. Under normal circumstances, cases involving capital punishment required careful legal procedures, reliable witnesses, and deliberation conducted during daylight hours. But this was no ordinary trial. Many historians and legal scholars have noted that several aspects of Jesus' hearing appear to conflict with the judicial customs described in later Jewish legal traditions. The proceedings took place during the night. Witnesses gave contradictory testimony, and the verdict seemed driven more by predetermined conclusions than by impartial examination. While scholars continue to debate the precise historical application of these legal traditions in the first century, the Gospel accounts consistently portray a process marked by urgency, irregularity, and intense political pressure. Witness after witness stepped forward. Some claimed Jesus had threatened to destroy the temple. Others distorted his teachings, yet their testimonies failed to agree. Finally, Caiaphas addressed Jesus directly. "I place you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." The room fell silent. For the first time that night, Jesus gave a direct answer. "You have said so, and from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." The word struck the council like thunder. Caiaphas tore his robes, a traditional expression of outrage, and declared that no further witnesses were needed. In their judgment, Jesus had committed blasphemy. The verdict came swiftly. He was declared worthy of death. As dawn slowly approached, the abuse intensified. Some spat in his face, others blindfolded him. Still others mocked him, striking him repeatedly while demanding, "Prophesy, who was it that struck you?" Meanwhile, outside in the courtyard, another tragedy was quietly unfolding. One of Jesus' closest disciples was about to face the greatest failure of his life. While Jesus endured mockery and condemnation inside the high priest's residence, Simon Peter remained outside in the courtyard, watching from a distance. Only hours earlier, Peter had made a bold promise. Even if every other disciple abandoned Jesus, he insisted that he never would. His loyalty seemed unshakable. But as the night grew colder, so did his confidence. A small fire burned in the center of the courtyard, where servants, guards, and bystanders gathered to warm themselves. Peter quietly joined them, hoping to remain unnoticed while keeping watch over the events unfolding inside. Then a servant girl looked closely at him. "You also were with Jesus of Nazareth." Peter immediately denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about." He moved farther toward the entrance, hoping to avoid further attention, but soon another person recognized him. "This man is one of his followers." Again, Peter denied it. "No, I'm not." Nearly an hour passed. Then another voice spoke with greater certainty. "Surely you are one of them. Your Galilean accent gives you away." Another bystander added that he had seen Peter in the garden during Jesus' arrest. Cornered by fear, Peter began to swear that he did not know Jesus at all. The words had barely left his mouth when the sound of a rooster broke the silence of the early morning. In that instant, Peter remembered Jesus' warning. "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. According to Luke's Gospel, something extraordinary happened next. Jesus turned and looked directly at Peter. No words were exchanged. No accusation was spoken. Yet that single glance carried unbearable weight. Peter understood immediately what he had done. Overcome with grief, he left the courtyard and wept bitterly. The man who would one day become one of Christianity's greatest leaders experienced one of the deepest moments of failure recorded in Scripture. But his story was not over. As dawn approached, the religious leaders reached an important realization. Although they had condemned Jesus for blasphemy, they lacked the legal authority to carry out a sentence of execution. Since Judea was under Roman rule, only the Roman governor possessed the power to authorize capital punishment. So they brought Jesus to the Praetorium, the official residence of Pontius Pilate. Pilate was no ordinary administrator. Appointed governor of Judea around AD 26 by Emperor Tiberius, he governed a region known for religious tension, political unrest, and frequent resistance to Roman occupation. Historical sources outside the Bible, including the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman writer Tacitus, portrayed Pilate as a firm and often uncompromising ruler who had already faced several conflicts with the Jewish population. The chief priests knew that accusing Jesus of blasphemy would mean little to a Roman official. Instead, they reframed the charges. They claimed that Jesus was misleading the nation, forbidding the payment of taxes to Caesar, and declaring himself to be a king. These were no longer religious accusations. They were political ones. For Rome, any claim to kingship outside the authority of Caesar could be interpreted as rebellion. Standing before the governor, bruised, exhausted, and bound after a night without sleep, Jesus was about to face the most powerful representative of the Roman Empire in Judea. The final judgment had begun. As the morning light spread across Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate stepped into the judgment hall to confront the prisoners standing before him. Unlike the religious leaders, Pilate had little interest in theological disputes. His responsibility was to protect Roman authority, collect taxes, and suppress rebellion. If Jesus truly claimed to be a political king, Rome would consider him a threat. If not, the governor had little reason to become involved in an internal religious conflict. Pilate looked directly at Jesus and asked the question that lay at the heart of the accusations. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered calmly. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest. But my kingdom is from another place." The response puzzled the Roman governor. Jesus spoke of kingship, yet not the kind Rome feared. He claimed authority, but not political power. After questioning him further, Pilate reached a conclusion that surprised the religious leaders waiting outside. "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But the chief priests refused to accept the verdict. They accused Jesus of stirring up the people throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee and continuing all the way to Jerusalem. The mention of Galilee gave Pilate an opportunity to avoid making the decision himself. Since Jesus was from Galilee, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas, the regional ruler who happened to be in Jerusalem for the Passover festival. Herod had long wanted to see Jesus. He had heard countless reports about his miracles and hoped to witness some astonishing sign with his own eyes. Standing before the ruler, however, Jesus remained completely silent. Herod questioned him repeatedly. He mocked him. His soldiers ridiculed him. Yet Jesus offered no defense. Disappointed and frustrated, Herod dressed Jesus in an elegant robe as an act of mockery, treating his claim to kingship as nothing more than a joke before sending him back to Pilate. Luke records an interesting historical detail. Although Pilate and Herod had previously been enemies, that day they became friends. The trial of Jesus unexpectedly ended a political rivalry. Back before the Roman governor, Pilate made one final attempt to release the prisoner. There was a Passover custom in which the governor would release one prisoner chosen by the crowd. Pilate believed the decision was obvious. Among the prisoners was a man named Barabbas. The Gospels describe him as an insurrectionist involved in rebellion and murder, exactly the kind of criminal Rome considered dangerous. Surely the people would choose the peaceful teacher from Nazareth over a convicted revolutionary. Pilate presented both men before the crowd. "Which one do you want me to release to you?" For a brief moment, everything stood still. Then the chief priests moved through the crowd, urging the people to demand the release of Barabbas instead. The voices grew louder. "Barabbas!" Pilate was stunned. "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" The answer thundered across the courtyard. "Crucify him!" Pilate questioned them again. "Why? What crime has he committed?" But the cries only became louder. "Crucify him!" The governor now faced an impossible choice. He knew Jesus appeared innocent, yet he also knew that another riot during Passover could threaten both his position and the fragile peace of Jerusalem. Political pressure, fear of unrest, and the demands of the crowd were about to outweigh justice itself. Pilate had reached his decision. Though convinced that Jesus had committed no crime deserving death, the Roman governor chose political stability over justice. Before handing him over for crucifixion, Pilate ordered that Jesus be scourged, a punishment so severe that many prisoners never survived to reach the execution site. Roman scourging was among the most brutal forms of corporal punishment in the ancient world. The condemned man was stripped of his clothing and bound to a stone pillar or wooden post. Roman soldiers used a whip known as the flagrum, consisting of several leather thongs, weighted with small pieces of bone, iron, or lead. Each strike tore through the skin and underlying tissue, causing devastating injuries designed to weaken the prisoner before execution. The Gospels do not dwell on the physical details. Instead, they simply state that Jesus was scourged. Even in their brevity, those words carried a meaning every first-century reader would immediately understand. After the scourging, the soldiers led Jesus into the governor's headquarters. There, they decided to mock the very accusation that had brought him before Pilate. If he claims to be a king, then let him look like one. They draped a scarlet robe over his wounded shoulders. They twisted together a crown made of long, sharp thorns and forced it onto his head. A reed was placed in his hand to imitate a royal scepter. Then the soldiers knelt before him in cruel imitation of homage. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They laughed. They spat upon him. They struck him repeatedly, taking the reed from his hand and beating him over the head, while the crown of thorns remained pressed against his scalp. To the soldiers, it was entertainment. To history, it became one of the greatest examples of innocent suffering ever recorded. Pilate then brought Jesus before the crowd once more. His body bore the unmistakable marks of the night's violence. "Here is the man," Pilate declared. Perhaps he hoped that the sight of Jesus, already beaten and humiliated, would satisfy the crowd's demands. Instead, the cries only intensified. "Crucify him!" Realizing that the situation was slipping beyond his control, Pilate performed a symbolic act before the assembled crowd. He washed his hands with water and declared, "I am innocent of this man's blood." Yet despite the gesture, the legal authority to authorize the execution remained his alone. The sentence was given. Jesus was led outside the city to carry the instrument of his own execution. Roman prisoners normally carried the horizontal crossbeam, known as the patibulum, while the upright post often remained permanently fixed at the execution site. Weakened by the scourging and exhausted after an entire night without sleep, Jesus struggled beneath its weight. As he made his way through Jerusalem's crowded streets, his strength began to fail. Seeing that he could no longer continue, the Roman soldiers stopped a passerby. His name was Simon of Cyrene. Originally from North Africa, Simon had come to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. Without warning, he was compelled by Roman authority to carry Jesus' cross for the remainder of the journey. It was an ordinary day for Simon, yet a single command from a Roman soldier forever placed his name in the pages of history. Behind them followed a large crowd. Some watched with curiosity, some mocked. Others wept openly. Among them were women mourning the fate of the man they believed to be innocent. But even then, Jesus turned his attention away from his own suffering. "Daughters of Jerusalem," he said, "do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." His words pointed beyond the events of that morning, toward the judgment that would one day come upon Jerusalem itself. Step by step, the procession climbed toward a place outside the city walls. The Romans called it the Place of the Skull. In Aramaic, it was known as Golgotha. There, the final act of history's most significant sacrifice was about to begin. As Jesus arrived at Golgotha, the soldiers offered him wine mixed with myrrh, a drink that could dull pain. After tasting it, he refused. He would face what lay ahead with a clear mind. The soldier stretched his arms across the wooden crossbeam. Iron nails were driven through his wrists or hands, securing him to the timber before the cross was raised into its upright position. His feet were then fastened below, leaving his body suspended between heaven and earth. Above his head, Pilate ordered an inscription to be placed: "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, the message could be read by nearly everyone passing by. The chief priests objected, asking Pilate to change the wording to, "He claimed to be King of the Jews," but Pilate refused. "What I have written, I have written." As Jesus hung on the cross, Roman soldiers divided his garments among themselves. His seamless tunic, woven in one piece, was too valuable to tear apart. Instead, they cast lots to determine who would keep it. An ordinary act of gambling, yet one that fulfilled words written centuries earlier in Psalm 22. Around the cross, different voices filled the air. Some mourned, others mocked. Religious leaders challenged him to save himself if he truly was the Messiah. Even one of the criminals crucified beside him joined in the insults. But the other saw something different. Recognizing both his own guilt and Jesus' innocence, he turned toward the man hanging beside him. "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Despite his own suffering, Jesus answered with remarkable compassion. "Truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." Nearby stood a small group who had remained faithful. Among them were Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and the disciple John. Looking down from the cross, Jesus entrusted his mother to John's care. "Woman, behold your son." Then to John, "Behold your mother." Even in his final hours, he continued caring for others. Around noon, an extraordinary darkness spread across the land. For approximately 3 hours, daylight faded. The Gospel writers record the event without attempting to explain its physical cause, presenting it instead as a moment of profound significance surrounding the death of Jesus. As the darkness continued, Jesus spoke words that echoed the opening line of Psalm 22. my God, why have you forsaken me?" To those listening nearby, the cry sounded mysterious. Yet to those familiar with the scriptures, it pointed to an ancient psalm describing suffering, rejection, and ultimate vindication, written centuries before Roman crucifixion even existed. Finally, knowing that his mission had reached its completion, Jesus declared, "It is finished." The Greek word recorded by John, tetelestai, carried the meaning of something fully accomplished, completely fulfilled, or paid in full. Then Jesus cried out once more, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," and he breathed his last. At that very moment, the Gospels describe a series of extraordinary events. The curtain separating the holy place from the most holy place in the temple was torn from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split apart. Even the Roman centurion overseeing the execution was deeply affected. Having witnessed everything that had taken place, he looked upon the crucified Jesus and declared, "Surely this man was the Son of God." The execution was over, but the story was far from finished. Then Jesus cried out once more, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," and he breathed his last. Long before that final moment, his ministry had already transformed countless lives. The blind had received their sight, the lame had walked again, those oppressed by evil had been set free. Even people once isolated because of leprosy had been restored to their families and communities. His compassion had reached the forgotten, the rejected, and the broken, leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after that day. At that very moment, the Gospels describe a series of extraordinary events. The curtain separating the holy place from the most holy place in the temple was torn from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split apart. Even the Roman centurion overseeing the execution was deeply affected. Having witnessed everything that had taken place, he looked upon the crucified Jesus and declared, "Surely this man was the Son of God." The execution was over, but the story was far from finished. If this documentary helped you see the final hours of Jesus in a deeper way, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter of this journey. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Which moment of Jesus' final hours impacted you the most, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments below.